I'm going to be telling you about the complete history of Blox Fruits all the way from 2019 to 2024. Blox Fruits first released on January 16, 2019, and this is when the game was in open beta, and the level capacity was literally 300. That was the max level, and there were not that many fruits in the game. The only fruits that existed were the bomb, spike, chop, smoke, rubber, flame, ice, dark, light, magma, quake, and Buddha fruit. And there were only 12 swords in the game: the katana, the dual katana, the cutlass, triple katana, shark saw, iron mace, warden sword, dark blade, Bacento, saber, dual-headed blade, and the pipe. And there were only 2 combat styles: the basic combat style everyone gets when they join the game, and the dark step fighting style, which you can buy in the pirate village. It was literally only 4 accessories, and you got the coat, the Tormer ring, the swordsman hat, and the pink coat. Then for the guns, we got the slingshot, musket, flintlock, refined slingshot, refined flintlock, and the cannon. Moving on to the second update of Blox Fruits that came out June 16th, 2019. And this is when the game was properly released to the public, and it was under the name Blox Piece. The max level was raised to 500, and they added the phoenix fruit as well as the spring fruit. And at this time, the phoenix fruit became incredibly popular and was widely known as the best fruit in the whole game. They also added the soul cane sword, which you can get from the living skeleton NPC at the magma village. They also added a new gun called the refined musket, and they also added a new fighting style called electric, which you can get from a rock next to Skyland. And they also added the magma island, and they also added a new NPC which lets you remove Blox Fruits. For some reason, I still don't know why this NPC exists. They also buffed a bunch of things and nerfed a bunch of things, and they also reworked some fruits. Moving on to update number 3, this was released on June 30th, literally like 14 days after, and this update was more about balancing the game with new content. The level capacity was raised up to 650. They added the string fruit as well as the rumble fruit. They also added 2 new swords. The first one is the trident, and the second one is the pole V1. They also added a new gun called the bazooka, which you can get from an NPC at Upper Sky. They also added a bunch of islands: the underwater city, the Skylands expansion, which basically just adds Upper Sky. They also added the Coliseum, a new NPC called the Lord of Destruction. They also finally added observation hockey to the game and added new abilities to the dark step fighting style. And at this time, they finally added tier 2 to weapons, so you could upgrade them at the blacksmith. They also buffed and nerfed a butt ton of things according to the community's suggestions. Moving on to update 3.5, this was released on July 2nd, literally like 3 days after the previous update. They added a new raid boss to the game called Greybeard, who's actually Whitebeard from One Piece, and they also added the Bacento V2, which is the sword he actually uses. And now you know why this update is called 3.5, because these were the only 2 things that were added. Moving on to update number 4, this was added on July 7th. They added a new fruit called the sand fruit. They also added a V2 to the dark blade and fixed a butt ton of bugs. Moving on to update number 5, this was released on July 14th, 2019, mostly focused on the addition of the new Fountain City Island, which is the final island for the first season. The new level capacity was raised to 750, and they also added the gravity fruit. And they also added the cool shades, which you can get from the cyborg boss located there. They also added one of the best fighting styles in the game to this day, water kung fu, and the reason for that is because you can upgrade it to Sharkman Karate later on, the literal best fighting style in the game for grinding. Moving on to update 6, this was the PvP and teams update. This update mostly focused on adding a PvP system, fruit balancing, crews, and bounty and honor. Mainly focused around the pirates and the marines. They added a lot more things people can do, and the most important thing you can't forget, bounty and honor for marines, I guess, but no one cares about that. Moving on to update 7, this came out August 11th, 2019, and this was a pretty minor update, but it was a much needed one to fix a butt ton of bugs. They also added the paw fruit. Moving on to update number 8, this is where they added the new world, aka the second sea, but at that time they called it the new world because that's what the second half of the Grand Line is called in One Piece. The new level capacity was raised up to 1000. They also added a new fruit called the barrier fruit, also added a butt ton of new islands: the Kingdom of Rose, the Green Zone, the Dark Arena, the Graveyard, Usopp's Island, and many other small remote islands. And they also added a butt ton of new swords: the long sword, the gravity cane, Sadi, Shisui, and Wado. They also added 2 new guns, the Sidam rifle and the Kabucha, and they also added a new fighting style called Dragon's Breath, which is not really that good of a fighting style and not a good use of fragments, so I don't recommend buying this. They also added a butt ton of new accessories: the black spike coat, the chopper hat, the top hat, the warrior helmet, the dark coat, and the swan glasses. A butt ton of new NPCs were also added, just generally help you in the game, stuff like stat resets and race changes. They also added new boats, the flower ship and the swan ship, and also a butt ton of new bosses to go with the quest: the diamond boss, the Jeremy boss, the Vegeta. They also finally added sea beast into the game as well as the Dawn Swan boss, and they even added a raid event, the factory raid, as well as a new raid boss, Darkbeard, who's literally just Blackbeard from One Piece. Moving on to update 9, this was the anti-copyright update, and this released on December 25th, 2019. This update was just focused on separating the game from One Piece, just trying to make more original content by rebranding a lot of things. The level capacity was raised up to 1100, and the community got one of the most beloved fruits in the game to this day, the dough fruit. It was finally added to the game. They also added a new island called the Snow Mountain, which you can find the superhuman fighting style on, which is still one of the hardest fighting styles to get to this day. They also added the true triple katana, which you can get by combining 3 other overpowered swords. They also changed a lot of visual aspects, contents, and most importantly, the names of a lot of things. Moving on to update 10, this came on April 17th, 2022, and this was focused on the new hot and cold island they added to the game, as well as balancing out a bunch of things in general. The new level capacity was raised to 1,250, and they added the control fruit to the game, which was the most expensive fruit at the time. They obviously also added the new hot and cold island, the Jitte sword, and the Cocoa sword. They also added the zebra cap, which you could get by defeating the order boss, aka Law. They also added a new boss called the Smoke Admiral, and they also nerfed the dough fruit a bit because it was way too overpowered at the time. Moving on to update 11, this was called the Awakenings update. This is where they added awakenings to fruits, but when it came out there were only 3 fruits you could awaken, and those were the Flame, Ice, and Quake. They added a new currency called Fragments, which replaced rare artifacts, and it's just much easier to use in my opinion. They also gave a new model to the Darkblade, which is not actually the model we have today. It was a model to kind of transition between the super old one and this new one. Moving on to update 12, this was the Halloween update, and it released on October 21st, 2020. The new level cap was raised to 1,350. They added fruit awakenings for the light fruit and the dark fruit. They also added a new sword called the Midnight Blade, a new gun called the Bizarre Rifle. They also added 3 new accessories, the Ghoul Mask, the blue spiky coat, and the red spiky coat. They also added a title system, and you could get titles by doing various things in the game, like defeating bosses and completing certain quests. Moving on to update 13, this was the Christmas update, and it released on December 23rd, 2020, mostly focused around Christmas related content being added to the game. The level cap was raised to 1,450, and they added the dragon fruit to the game and let you change the colors of it. They also added a new fruit awakening for the string fruit and a new fighting style called Death Step, which is the upgraded version of Dark Step. They also added a new legendary sword called Red Goku, which you could get from the very new Ice Castle Island. And they obviously also enabled the Christmas event, so you had access to the Santa Claus, the Magic Elf, the Blox Food Dealer's cousin, which actually became a permanent addition to the game, as well as the Greedy Elf. And they also added a button of new titles to the game. Moving on to update 14, this came on March 20th, 2021. This was mostly just focused on fixing a butt ton of bugs that were in the game. The new level cap was raised to 1,525, and they added a new island called the Forgotten Island, and this was the final island in the second sea before you could access the third sea. So most people just predicted the third sea was going to come out at this time, and their predictions were right. They also added a new awakening for the Rumble Fruit and a new fighting style called Sharkman Karate, which to this day is the best grinding fighting style in the whole game. They also added a new race called the Cyborg, which Loki specializes against teamers. Then we also got 2 new swords, the Pole V2 and the Dragon Titan. They also added a pretty cool thing where if you killed YouTubers, you would earn the title for killing them, as well as 250,000 belly and 2,500 fragments. So I guess if you're friends with a YouTuber, you can just kind of farm them for fragments and belly. That's pretty overpowered. Moving on to update 15, like the community predicted, this was the third sea update, and this update obviously focused on the third sea. The level cap was raised to 2,000. They added a button of new islands, the Floating Turtle, Hydra Island, Port Town, Great Tree, and the Castle on the Sea. They also added a new fighting style called Electric Claw, which was the upgraded version of the electric fighting style. They also added a button of new swords, the Yama sword, the Tushina sword, Dark Dagger, Cavender, and Twin Hoods. And they also added a bunch of new accessories, the Lei accessory, the Pilot helmet, Musketeer hat, Jaw shield, Pretty helmet, Valkyrie helmet, Bandana, and the Hunter cape. They also added a new gun called the Serpent Bow. They also added 7 new fruits. They added the Venom fruit, the Spin fruit, the Door fruit, the Kilo fruit, the Diamond fruit, the Love fruit, and the Falcon fruit. They also added fruit awakenings for the Magma fruit and the Buddha fruit, 2 of the most favorite fruits by the whole Blox Fruits community. And like the previous updates, they also added a button of new titles to the game, and they finally added the fruit inventory and trading. They also added Observation V2, which is a lot more overpowered than the V1. They also added arenas throughout all the seas where you can do friendly 1v1s against your friends. Moving on to update 16, this was the Halloween update for 2021. They added 2 new fruits, and these are both Halloween themed, the Shadow fruit as well as the Revive fruit. And they also enabled the Halloween event where you can collect bones by defeating enemies, and you can roll for a surprise at an NPC called the Death King. And just like the Blox Food Dealer's cousin from before, this came to be a permanent addition to the game. And they also added a new island called the Haunted Castle, and that's where you could actually find that NPC. And they also added a new raid boss called the Soul Reaper. If you killed him, you would get a sword called the Halo Scythe. They also added a new fighting style called Dragon Talon, which is an upgraded version of Dragon's Breath from before. They added 3 new accessories, the barriers, the Golden Sun Hat, the Holy Crown, and they also added a button of new titles. Moving on to update 17, this was the Christmas update, raising the max level to 2,200. They added a new fruit called the Soul. They also added 2 new islands, the Peanut Island and Ice Cream Land, which is a part of the Sea of Treats. They also added a new awakening for the Sand Fruit, as well as the sword called the Buddy Sword. They also added an Easter egg called the Vietnam Cone. Moving on to update 18, this was the infamous Race V4 update, which basically just lets you upgrade every race in the game to V4, and this is also known as the final stage of the race. But who knows, if they maybe add a 4th C one day, they might also add a Race V5. You never know what's coming. Moving on to update 19, this was the Valentine's event update. They reworked the Love Fruit to actually be somewhat of a decent fruit, and they just reworked a bunch of things in general. Moving on to update 20, this was one of the biggest updates in the game by far. They added the mammoth fruit and the sound fruit, which were some of the most popular fruits when the update came out. They also replaced the kilo fruit with the rocket fruit, because I guess they got too many copyright problems with that. And they also added a new fighting style called the Sanguine Art fighting style, which is one of the hardest fighting styles to get to this day. They also added a new sword called the Shark Anchor and a bunch of new accessories. The Leviathan Shield, the Leviathan Crown, the Terror Jaw, and the Shark Tooth Necklace. They also added a new island called Tiki Outpost and 2 new boats, the Sloop and the Beast Hunter. They also reworked all of the other boats in the game. And they reworked literally every single sword that exists. There wasn't one sword that was left alone. And this was honestly for the greater good, because these swords' abilities are honestly 10 times better looking now. Moving on to update 21, this came out on November 2nd, 2023. They reworked the Revive fruit into the Ghost fruit and changed it up a bit. Pretty sure they mainly did this to just avoid copyright. Moving on to update 22, this was called the Kitsune update, and this is when the Kitsune fruit came out, making it the most expensive fruit in the game, capping out at 8 million Philly. Damn, that is one expensive fruit. And they also added this event called Kitsune Island, where you can get a new aura color and title. They also added a new sword called the Fox Lamp, and they also added 2 Kitsune-based accessories called the Kitsune Mask and the Kitsune Ribbon. Moving on to update 23, this is where they added the T-Rex fruit, and they also added Shipwright subclass, and this is the only subclass in the game right now, but I'm guessing in the next few updates they're gonna add a butt ton more. And that's pretty much where the game is right now.